Nobody could understand why Maren Holt kept saying no. The tractor had sat behind the equipment shed for 6 years, rusted orange in patches, one headlight hanging by a wire, tires cracked and half flat. Buyers had come twice that spring alone. One offered $800 for parts. Another offered $1,200 in a trailer hitch he didn't need. Both times, Maren, 14 years old, said the same thing. It's not for sale. Her father hadn't asked her opinion either time. He hadn't needed to. The tractor was hers to decide about, ever since her grandfather left it to her specifically, in writing, the year he died. Everyone in Ashcroft County thought that was strange too. An old man leaving a broken-down 1962 Farmall to a 9-year-old girl instead of cash, instead of land, instead of anything that made sense. If quiet stubbornness and the wisdom hidden in ordinary things move you, subscribe and join us every week. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. Ashcroft County sat in the high plains of western Nebraska, where the wind never really stopped and the land rolled out flat and gold for miles in every direction. The Holts had farmed wheat and sorghum there since 1931, through the dust years, through droughts that broke other families and sent them west. Maren's father, Dale Holt, ran 400 acres now, mostly with equipment financed up to its ears, because that was how farming worked in the 21st century. Big loans, bigger machines, and margins so thin a single bad season could undo a decade of good ones. Maren's mother, Priscilla, taught 3rd grade in town and kept the family's finances in a spreadsheet she updated every Sunday night with the kind of grim discipline that came from watching too many neighbors lose everything. Maren had one brother, Colton, 16, who wanted nothing to do with the farm and had already told anyone who'd listen that he was leaving for trade school the day he graduated. It was Maren's grandfather, Ivo Holt, who'd left the tractor behind, and the notebook that came with it, tucked into the tool drawer under the seat, wrapped in a plastic bread bag to keep out the damp. Ivo had farmed that same ground for 51 years before his hands got too unsteady to keep going. He'd been a quiet man, the kind who fixed things instead of talking about them, and the notebook was full of his handwriting. Diagrams, measurements, notes on soil, notes on machines, notes on things that had gone wrong and how he'd made them right. Maren had read every page of it 3 times over by the time she was 11. The trouble that made the tractor matter started 2 years after Ivo died. The Springdale's newest equipment. A combine harvester bought on a loan that made Priscilla's stomach hurt every time she looked at the payment schedule, broke down in the middle of harvest. Not a small problem. The engine's computer module had failed, the kind of failure that couldn't be fixed with a wrench and a Saturday afternoon. It needed a replacement part that had to be ordered from 3 states away, and the dealership's earliest delivery date was 11 days out. 11 days, in the middle of harvest, with a storm system building in the Dakotas that every forecast said would hit Ashcroft County within the week. Dale stood in the field that afternoon with his hands on his hips, doing math in his head that didn't come out right no matter how he ran it. 11 days of lost harvest, against a crop worth roughly $200,000 sitting exposed to weather that could ruin half of it in a single afternoon. He called every equipment rental company within 100 miles. Nothing available. Harvest season meant everyone needed everything, all at once. That night at dinner, nobody said much. Colton scrolled his phone. Priscilla pushed food around her plate without eating it. Maren sat quiet, thinking about the notebook. The next morning, before anyone else was awake, she was in the equipment shed with a socket wrench and a flashlight, going over the old Farmall inch by inch. Here's what most people in Ashcroft County didn't know about Maren, and what her grandfather had understood better than almost anyone. A 1962 Farmall wasn't fast. It wasn't efficient by modern standards. But it was mechanically simple in a way modern equipment wasn't. No computer modules, no electronic sensors that could fail without warning, nothing that couldn't be fixed with parts you could find in a junkyard or fabricate by hand if you had to. Ivo's notebook was full of exactly this kind of knowledge. How to keep an old machine running decade after decade using nothing but patience and understanding of how each part related to every other part. The tractor hadn't run in 6 years. The fuel lines were dry-rotted. The battery was dead. One tire held air for about 4 hours before it needed refilling again. It wouldn't harvest 400 acres. Nothing that old could, not against a storm deadline. But it could run a smaller attachment, An old grain auger sitting rusted in the same shed. Something that, paired with hand-cutting equipment and every able body on the farm, might just be enough to save the most exposed 20 acres before the storm hit. Not everything, but something. Maren spent that first day just getting the engine to turn over. The fuel lines needed replacing entirely. She found the right gauge tubing in a box of parts Ivo had left, labeled in his cramped handwriting exactly for this purpose, as though he'd known someday someone would need it. The battery she swapped from an old riding mower. By evening, the engine coughed, sputtered, and died 3 times before finally catching and holding a rough, uneven idle. Colton wandered out to watch, arms crossed, skeptical. "That thing's not going to save $200,000 of wheat," he said. "Not by itself," Maren said. "But it doesn't have to." The second day, the front left tire blew entirely while she was testing the drivetrain, the old rubber finally giving out after years of slow decay. She didn't have money for a new tire. What she had was a plug kit from the notebook supply list and 3 hours of patient, frustrating work getting the old rim to hold a seal at all. It failed twice before it finally held. Dale found her out there that evening, hands black with grease, and asked what exactly she thought she was doing. She told him, not everything, but enough. The auger, the 20 acres closest to the tree line where wind damage would hit worst first, the plan to hand-cut what the auger couldn't manage and load it before the storm. He didn't say it was a bad idea. He also didn't say it was a good one. He just stood there a long moment, the way a man stands when he's recalculating something he thought he already understood, and then he went and got his own tools. They worked through the third day together, mostly in silence, the way Ivo and Dale used to work together before the old man's hands gave out. By that evening, the Farmall ran, not smooth, not fast, but it ran, pulling the old auger behind it in slow, grinding passes across the closest field. The storm arrived on the 5th day, 2 days ahead of the part delivery, exactly as the forecast had warned. It tore through Ashcroft County with hail the size of marbles and wind that flattened unharvested wheat across 3/4 of the county. The Holt's main crop, still waiting on the broken combine, took real damage. Nobody could have prevented that. But the 20 acres nearest the tree line, the ones Maren and her father had worked around the clock to bring in using a 60-year-old tractor and an old grain auger, were already in the bins by the time the first hailstone fell. It wasn't everything. It was, by Dale's later estimate, worth somewhere around $18,000 of crop that would otherwise have been destroyed. Not enough to fix everything the storm cost them elsewhere, but enough, combined with insurance on the rest, to keep them from having to take out another loan just to make it through winter. Neighbors who heard about it started showing up that fall, curious, some of them openly skeptical, wanting to see the tractor that had apparently outworked machines 40 years newer than itself. One of them, a man named Foster Klein who'd farmed the section next door for 30 years, stood looking at the old Farmall for a long time before asking Maren straight out how she'd known it would work. "I didn't know," she said. "I just knew it was the only thing we had that couldn't break the same way the new stuff did." Wendell Berry once wrote that the soil is the great connector of our lives, the source and destination of all. Maren hadn't set out to prove anything that grand. She'd set out to fix a tractor because a notebook told her how, and because something in her had never quite believed that old and broken meant useless. Her grandfather had understood that decades before she was born, that the newest equipment wasn't always the most reliable equipment, that sometimes the thing worth keeping was the thing simple enough to fix with your own 2 hands when everything else had failed. Maren is 16 now. The Farmall still runs, parked in its usual spot behind the shed, though it gets used every harvest season now instead of sitting idle. She's rebuilt the second headlight, replaced every hose and gasket the old notebook mentioned needed replacing, and started a second notebook of her own, in her own handwriting, for whoever comes after her. Colton still says he's leaving for trade school. But last spring, without telling anyone why, he spent a Saturday afternoon out in the shed with his sister, learning how to bleed a fuel line. What's something old in your family that turned out to matter more than anyone expected? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. And if stories like this one mean something to you, subscribe. We'd love to have you along.